March 24, 1945, 30,000 feet above the Adriatic Sea, the morning sun cast long shadows across a formation of American B-17 bombers grinding their way toward Berlin. Inside the lead aircraft, Captain Robert Mitchell gripped his control yoke with hands that had stopped trembling months ago, his eyes scanning the horizon for the inevitable appearance of enemy fighters. The bomber crews had learned to expect attacks within minutes of crossing into German airspace. What they didn't expect was the color of the fighter planes that would soon be protecting them. Because sometimes the most dangerous assumptions aren't about the enemy in front of you, but about the allies flying beside you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mathematics of aerial warfare in 1944 were brutally simple. American bomber formations penetrating deep into Nazi Germany faced fighter attacks that could reduce entire squadrons to burning wreckage in minutes. The Luftwaffe had spent years perfecting techniques for destroying the heavy bombers that threatened the Reich's industrial capacity. Their pilots were experienced, their aircraft were fast, and their tactics had been refined through thousands of combat engagements. The loss rates spoke for themselves. On some missions, 20% of bombers failed to return. Entire crews, 10 men per aircraft, vanished into the European sky, reduced to statistics in mission reports filed by surviving squadron commanders. The strategic bombing campaign had become a war of attrition that America was winning only through the sheer volume of aircraft and trained crews it could deploy. For every German factory destroyed, dozens of American airmen died in the cold darkness at altitude. Their bodies never recovered, their families left with telegrams that offered sympathy but no closure. The burden of protecting these vulnerable bombers fell to fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that accompanied the formations engaging enemy fighters before they could reach the bombers. But the fighter pilots faced their own challenges. German aircraft were formidable, their pilots skilled, and the tactical advantage of fighting over their own territory meant damaged German fighters could attempt emergency landings while American pilots faced capture or death if forced down. Into this cauldron of high-altitude combat came a group of pilots whose very presence generated controversy that had nothing to do with their flying skills. The 332nd Fighter Group, trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, consisted entirely of black aviators who had fought their way through a military system designed to exclude them. Their journey to combat had required overcoming obstacles that white pilots never faced, proving themselves repeatedly to skeptics who believed that African Americans lacked the intelligence, reflexes, and courage necessary for air. The prejudices they confronted weren't subtle or hidden. Military leadership had initially opposed the very concept of black combat pilots, arguing that integration would undermine unit cohesion and that training resources would be wasted on men biologically unsuited for the demands of modern warfare. These weren't fringe opinions but official positions defended with pseudo-scientific theories and cultural assumptions so deeply embedded that they were rarely questioned. The Tuskegee experiment, as it became known, had been authorized reluctantly, under political pressure from civil rights organizations and black newspapers that demanded equal participation in the war effort. The expectation among many military officials was that the experiment would fail, providing evidence that could justify continued segregation. The training facility at Tuskegee had been deliberately isolated, located in rural Alabama where the surrounding community's racial attitudes ensured that the black aviators would face hostility even outside the base. The instructors, initially all white, had been carefully selected for their willingness to train black students, though many arrived with doubts about whether their efforts would produce combat-ready pilots. The standards applied to Tuskegee cadets were notably higher than those required of white aviation students. Every flight was scrutinized for evidence of inadequacy. Every academic test was graded with particular attention to mistakes that might confirm existing prejudices. The washout rate was deliberately elevated, ensuring that only the most exceptional candidates completed training. Those who graduated from Tuskegee carried the weight of representing their entire race. Their success or failure would be interpreted not as individual performance but as evidence about the capabilities of all black Americans. This burden, added to the normal stresses of combat aviation, created psychological pressures that white pilots never experienced. They couldn't simply be good pilots, they had to be perfect, because anything less would be used to justify the exclusion of everyone who looked like them. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been among the first class to complete training at Tuskegee. His path to the cockpit had required navigating obstacles that began long before he ever touched an aircraft. Growing up in Detroit, he watched newsreels of aerial combat during the First World War, dreaming of flight with the intensity that only childhood imagination can generate. But every inquiry about aviation training had been met with the same response. The Army Air Corps didn't accept Negro applicants. The reasons varied depending on who was offering them, sometimes framed as concerns about unit cohesion, other times expressed more bluntly as assertions that black men lacked the mental capacity for complex tasks like flying. Webb had pursued education with the focused determination of someone who understood that credentials might eventually overcome prejudice. He completed college with honors, earned a private pilot's license through a civilian program that accepted black students, and accumulated flight hours by working as a crop duster in the summers. When the Tuskegee program finally opened, his application was among the first submitted. The selection process had been intentionally rigorous, designed to identify candidates whose abilities were so undeniable that even skeptics would struggle to question their qualifications. The training itself had revealed the depth of institutional resistance to the very concept of black combat pilots. White officers who supervised the program often made clear their belief that the entire effort was misguided.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Training aircraft were older models, less reliable than those provided to white cadets. Maintenance was adequate but not generous. The implicit message was clear. Resources invested in training black pilots were resources diverted from more promising uses. Webb had learned to ignore the skepticism, focusing instead on mastering every aspect of aviation that would be required in combat. Navigation, gunnery, formation flying, emergency procedures, each skill practiced until it became instinctive. He understood that mistakes that would be forgiven in white pilots would be interpreted as evidence of racial inadequacy when made by Tuskegee graduates. By the time the 332nd Fighter Group deployed to Italy in early 1944, its pilots had accumulated more training hours than most white fighter squadrons received. They had been tested more thoroughly, scrutinized more carefully, and held to higher standards than their peers. Yet the assumption among bomber crews and other fighter groups was that the Tuskegee Airmen, as they had become known, were an experiment likely to fail under the pressures of actual combat. The skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded by conventional military logic. These pilots had no combat experience. They were flying missions over some of the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Their aircraft, while capable, were often older models that had been cycled out from white squadrons. The tactical challenges they faced were identical to those confronting experienced white pilots, but they carried the additional burden of knowing that their performance would be used to judge the capabilities of their entire race. The German pilots they would face in combat operated under no such psychological burdens. The Luftwaffe had its own racial theories, viewing Americans as culturally and militarily inferior to German warriors. The prospect of facing black American pilots added another layer to their contempt. Nazi ideology held particularly virulent views about racial hierarchies, and the idea that African Americans could be effective combat pilots seemed laughable to men who had been indoctrinated with theories of Aryan supremacy. German intelligence reports on the 332nd Fighter Group reflected this dismissive attitude. The analysis noted the presence of black pilots with a mixture of curiosity and derision, predicting that they would prove ineffective in combat and would likely be withdrawn after sustaining heavy losses. Luftwaffe briefings characterized the Tuskegee Airmen as propaganda tools rather than serious military threats. The assumption was that their presence represented American political theater, an attempt to demonstrate racial equality that would collapse when confronted with the realities of aerial combat. German pilots joked about the red-tailed P-51s that marked the 332nd Fighter Group, referring to them with racial slurs that reflected the casual racism embedded in Nazi military culture. The expectation was that encounters with these inexperienced black pilots would provide easy victories, opportunities to demonstrate the superiority that German propaganda had been proclaiming throughout the war. This combination of American skepticism and German contempt created a situation where the Tuskegee Airmen faced doubters on both sides of the conflict. Their own military questioned whether they belonged in combat. Their enemies assumed they would be easy targets. The psychological pressure of operating in this environment would have been crushing for pilots with anything less than absolute confidence in their abilities and their mission. The first combat missions flown by the 332nd Fighter Group in early 1944 had been carefully monitored by military observers looking for evidence to confirm their preconceptions. The pilots understood that every engagement would be scrutinized, every decision analyzed for signs of the inadequacy that skeptics expected to find. They flew with the knowledge that mistakes made by individual pilots would be attributed to racial characteristics rather than the normal variability of human performance under stress. Captain James Hawthorne had been among the squadron commanders tasked with leading the Tuskegee Airmen into combat. His leadership style reflected the unique pressures his unit faced. He couldn't simply focus on tactical effectiveness. He had to ensure that his pilots maintained the discipline and precision necessary to refute the racist assumptions that surrounded their deployment. Every mission briefing included reminders that they were representing not just their squadron but their entire race. Every tactical decision was made with awareness that failure would be interpreted through the lens of existing prejudices. The bomber crews they were assigned to protect initially greeted their arrival with reactions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. White aviators who had spent months developing trust in their usual fighter escorts viewed the introduction of black pilots as an unnecessary experiment that might get them killed. Some bomber commanders requested reassignment of different escort fighters, arguing that their crews' lives shouldn't depend on unproven pilots. These requests were generally denied, not out of confidence in the Tuskegee Airmen, but because fighter pilot resources were stretched too thin to accommodate such preferences. The tension was visible during pre-mission briefings where bomber and fighter crews coordinated their operations. White officers addressed the Tuskegee pilots with barely concealed doubt, questioning their understanding of escort tactics, their familiarity with enemy fighter capabilities, their ability to maintain formation discipline under combat conditions. The implication was clear. These black pilots were being given a chance they probably didn't deserve, and white bomber crews would pay the price if the experiment failed. Webb remembered the first time he heard a bomber pilot openly question whether the red-tailed fighters would actually engage enemy aircraft or would break formation at the first sign of combat. The accusation of cowardice, delivered with casual certainty, had struck harder than any enemy fire. It represented the fundamental assumption that black men lacked the courage necessary for combat, a prejudice so deeply rooted that it persisted despite all evidence to the contrary. The response from Tuskegee pilots couldn't be verbal arguments or emotional reactions. It had to be performance that was so undeniable that even the most committed skeptics would struggle to explain it away. They understood that they needed to be not just competent but exceptional, not just brave but seemingly fearless, not just effective but so consistently successful that their achievements couldn't be dismissed as luck or accident. The tactical challenge they faced was complicated by the limitations of their assigned role. Fighter escorts were expected to protect bombers, which meant staying close to the formations rather than pursuing enemy fighters that broke off from attacks. This defensive posture was tactically sound but limited opportunities for the dramatic victories that might change opinions about black pilots' capabilities. Some white fighter squadrons had developed reputations for aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft, racking up impressive kill counts even if it meant occasionally leaving bomber formations vulnerable. The Tuskegee Airmen adopted a different approach, one that reflected both tactical necessity and awareness of the scrutiny under which they operated. They would stay with the bombers no matter what. Enemy fighters that attacked would be engaged, but the primary mission was always protection of the heavy bombers that were the actual strategic weapons in the air campaign. This commitment to mission discipline would eventually become their trademark, but it began as a calculated decision based on understanding that accusations of abandoning bombers would be used as evidence of racial inadequacy. The German pilots who encountered the red-tailed fighters in early engagements initially maintained their dismissive attitudes. Intelligence reports from debriefed Luftwaffe pilots captured the contemptuous tone with which they described encounters with black American aviators. The accounts portrayed the Tuskegee pilots as tentative, overly cautious, lacking the aggressive spirit that characterized effective fighter pilots. These assessments reflected both genuine tactical observations and the racial prejudices that shaped how German pilots interpreted what they witnessed. The defensive posture adopted by the 332nd Fighter Group was characterized as timidity rather than disciplined escort tactics. Their reluctance to break formation in pursuit of fleeing enemy fighters was described as lack of initiative rather than mission focus. The racial slurs that appeared in German combat reports revealed the degree to which Nazi ideology influenced military assessments. The possibility that these black pilots might be competent wasn't seriously considered. Their presence was treated as a curiosity, perhaps even an insult to Luftwaffe professionalism, but not as a genuine military threat. This German contempt would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, one that would cost the Luftwaffe dearly in the skies over Europe. Because while German pilots were dismissing the red-tailed fighters as propaganda tools, the Tuskegee Airmen were developing tactics and building experience that would transform them into one of the most effective fighter groups in the European theater. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It emerged through dozens of missions where the red-tailed fighters proved that their commitment to protecting bombers was absolute. German fighters that attempted attacks on bomber formations found themselves engaged by pilots who refused to be distracted or drawn away from their charges. The aggressive pursuit tactics that worked against other American fighter escorts proved ineffective against pilots whose entire focus remained on defensive coverage. Lieutenant Raymond Foster had been flying wing position for Webb during a mission in late spring of 1944 when the tactical sophistication of Luftwaffe pilots became devastatingly clear. The attack had come from multiple directions simultaneously, German fighters diving through the bomber formation while others swept in from the flanks, attempting to draw escort fighters out of position. It was a coordinated assault that exploited the natural instinct of fighter pilots to pursue attacking aircraft, but the Tuskegee Airmen had trained specifically for such scenarios. Rather than breaking formation to chase individual German fighters, they maintained their positions around the bombers, engaging threats as they emerged but never allowing themselves to be pulled away from their protective role. The discipline required to resist the temptation to pursue fleeing enemy aircraft was immense. Fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive, to press attacks, to rack up victories. Watching German fighters escape after being driven off attacks felt like failure, even when the bombers remained protected. Foster had tracked a Messerschmitt Bf 109 through his gun sight, his finger tightening on the trigger, as the enemy fighter broke off its attack run and dove away from the formation. Every instinct screamed to follow, to finish the engagement, to claim the kill that would validate his skills as a combat pilot. But Webb's voice over the radio had been calm and absolute. "Stay with the bombers. Let him go. Mission first." The German pilot had escaped, probably returning to base to fly again another day, but the bomber he had been attacking continued toward its target, its crew alive because their escort had prioritized protection over personal glory. These decisions, repeated across dozens of missions, began to create a reputation that even skeptical bomber crews couldn't ignore. The red-tailed fighters stayed. They didn't chase glory. They didn't abandon their charges to rack up kill counts. They remained in position, engagement after engagement, providing the kind of reliable protection that bomber crews desperately needed. The statistics started telling a story that contradicted every prejudiced assumption about black pilots' capabilities. Bomber groups, escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group, experienced dramatically lower loss rates than those protected by other fighter squadrons. The difference was measurable, significant, and impossible to explain away as coincidence or luck. White bomber crews who had initially greeted the Tuskegee Airmen with skepticism began specifically requesting the red-tailed fighters for their missions. The transformation in attitude was gradual but undeniable. Men who had questioned whether black pilots could be trusted with their lives became ardent defenders of the 332nd Fighter Group's effectiveness. The evidence was written in survival rates, in missions completed, in crews that made it home because their escorts had refused to be drawn away from defensive positions. Captain Mitchell, the bomber pilot who had crossed the Adriatic that March morning in 1945, had flown his first missions with different fighter escorts. He remembered the anxiety of watching his protective fighters peel away in pursuit of enemy aircraft, leaving the bomber formation vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The aggressive fighter pilots who chased every engagement made for exciting combat reports but left bombers exposed at critical moments. His first mission escorted by the red-tailed fighters had been a revelation. The German attacks had come with typical ferocity, multiple fighters coordinating their assault to overwhelm defensive positions, but the Tuskegee pilots had remained in formation, engaging threats methodically, never allowing themselves to be drawn out of position. Mitchell had watched in amazement as enemy fighters that would normally have pressed their attacks instead broke off early, apparently unwilling to face the disciplined defensive fire from escorts that wouldn't be distracted. The mission had been completed with 0 bomber losses, a result that seemed almost miraculous given the intensity of the enemy attacks they had faced. Mitchell's crew had returned to base with new respect for the pilots flying the distinctive red-tailed fighters. The color that had initially seemed like unnecessary marking now appeared as a promise of protection, a visual guarantee that their escorts wouldn't abandon them. By summer of 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen had accumulated enough combat experience to begin developing tactical innovations that exploited German assumptions about their capabilities. The Luftwaffe pilots still approached encounters with the red-tailed fighters with barely concealed contempt, expecting easy victories against pilots they assumed were incompetent. This arrogance created opportunities for the kind of tactical surprises that could shift the balance of aerial engagement. Webb had been studying German attack patterns, noting how enemy pilots seemed to commit more aggressively when engaging the 332nd Fighter Group than when facing other American squadrons. The German pilots expected black aviators to make mistakes, to panic under pressure, to provide the easy victories that would confirm Nazi racial theories. What they actually encountered was something entirely different. Pilots who had been held to higher standards throughout their training, who had been forced to develop skills beyond those required of white aviators, who understood that every engagement would be scrutinized for evidence of their competence or inadequacy. The Tuskegee Airmen flew with precision that bordered on obsessive, their formation discipline unshakable, their tactical decisions calculated with an awareness that mistakes would be interpreted as racial rather than individual failings. The Germans had been laughing at the red-tailed fighters since their first appearance over Europe. The laughter was about to stop in the most decisive way possible, because the Tuskegee Airmen weren't just fighting German pilots, they were fighting prejudice, assumptions, and the weight of history itself. And they were about to demonstrate that underestimating someone based on the color of their skin was a mistake that could cost everything. The transformation began on a morning that seemed identical to dozens that had preceded it. August 17, 1944, the target was an oil refinery deep in German territory, a facility whose destruction would cripple fuel production for the Luftwaffe. The mission planners knew the Germans would defend it with everything available, which meant the bomber formations could expect sustained attacks from multiple fighter squadrons coordinated to overwhelm escort defenses. Webb led his flight of 4 P-51 Mustangs into position alongside the bomber formation as they crossed into hostile air. The red tails marked them clearly against the morning sky, a visual signature that had become familiar to both friend and enemy. Below, German radar stations tracked the incoming raid, scrambling fighter units from bases scattered across the region. The Luftwaffe response would be massive, designed to inflict maximum casualties before the bombers could reach their target. The first German fighters appeared exactly where tactical doctrine predicted they would, climbing to altitude from the northeast, positioning themselves for diving attacks through the bomber formation. Webb counted at least 20 enemy aircraft in the initial wave, with more appearing as additional squadrons joined the engagement. The odds were challenging but not unprecedented. What made this engagement different was the tactical decision Webb made in the seconds before the German attack commenced. Rather than waiting for the enemy fighters to initiate their assault, Webb led his flight in a preemptive strike against the German formation, while it was still organizing for its attack run. The maneuver violated the conservative escort tactics that the 332nd Fighter Group had employed throughout their deployment, but Webb had recognized something in the German positioning that suggested opportunity. The enemy pilots were clustered too tightly, confident in their numerical advantage, expecting the red-tailed fighters to maintain their usual defensive posture. The surprise was complete. Webb's flight tore through the German formation before the enemy pilots fully registered what was happening. His opening burst caught a Focke-Wulf Fo 190 as it began its dive toward the bombers, the rounds walking across the aircraft's wing route and into the fuselage. The German fighter shuddered, rolled inverted and began falling toward the earth, trailing smoke and debris. Foster, flying wing position, engaged a second F-Bull 190 that was attempting to evade Webb's initial attack. The German pilot was skilled, throwing his aircraft into a series of violent maneuvers designed to spoil Foster's aim. But Foster had spent hundreds of hours in training specifically preparing for this kind of engagement. His burst was short, precise, and devastating. The F-Bull 190's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled and entered an uncontrolled spin that no amount of pilot skill could recover. The remaining German fighters scattered, their carefully planned attack run disrupted before it could develop. Some attempted to reform for another approach. Others dove away from the engagement entirely, unwilling to face escort fighters that had demonstrated such aggressive capability. The bombers continued toward their target unmolested, their crews watching in amazement as the red-tailed fighters had neutralized a threat that should have resulted in significant losses. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, but its implications rippled through both American and German command structures. Bomber crews radioed excited reports about their escorts' performance. German pilots returned to their bases describing encounters with black American fighters whose skill and aggression contradicted every assumption about their capabilities. The intelligence assessments that had characterized the Tuskegee Airmen as incompetent propaganda tools required immediate revision. What followed over the next 6 weeks would shatter every prejudiced expectation about black combat pilots. The 332nd Fighter Group, having demonstrated that defensive tactics could transition seamlessly into offensive action, began pressing their tactical advantages with increasing confidence. German fighters that approached bomber formations expecting easy victories found themselves engaged by pilots whose training, discipline, and motivation exceeded anything the Luftwaffe had encountered from other American squadrons. Captain Hawthorne studied mission reports with growing satisfaction as the pattern became undeniable. German fighters were avoiding engagements with the red-tailed escorts. When combat occurred, Luftwaffe losses were disproportionately high compared to encounters with other American fighter groups. The tactical sophistication that Tuskegee pilots brought to their missions reflected the intensity of their training and the psychological drive created by knowing they were representing their entire race. The German High Command recognized the problem before American leadership fully appreciated what was happening. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from September 1944 documented increasing losses to the red-tailed fighters and recommended tactical adjustments to counter their effectiveness. The contemptuous dismissal that had characterized earlier assessments disappeared, replaced by professional respect for adversaries who had proven themselves formidable in combat. The breakthrough mission occurred on September 12, 1944. The target was Berlin itself, a deep penetration raid designed to demonstrate that American bombers could strike the German capital with relative impunity despite the massive air defenses protecting it. The Luftwaffe committed everything available to stopping the raid, launching over 200 fighters to intercept the bomber formations before they could reach their target. Webb Squadron encountered the main German fighter force 30 miles west of Berlin. The enemy aircraft were organized in multiple layers, high and low, positioned to attack from every angle simultaneously. The tactical plan was sound, designed to overwhelm escort fighters through sheer numbers and coordinated execution. What the German commanders hadn't anticipated was the tactical flexibility that Tuskegee pilots would demonstrate when conventional defensive tactics proved insufficient. The engagement developed into the kind of massive aerial battle that would be analyzed by military historians for decades. Over 50 aircraft, both American and German, maneuvering at high speed and altitude, each pilot making split-second decisions that determined whether he lived or died. The sky filled with tracer rounds burning aircraft and parachutes as pilots from both sides were forced to abandon damaged planes. Webb found himself engaged with a German ace whose aircraft bore victory markings, indicating at least 30 confirmed kills. The enemy pilot was skilled, aggressive, and flew with the confidence of someone who had survived countless engagements. The dogfight that developed tested every aspect of Webb's training and natural ability. The two aircraft twisted through the sky, each pilot seeking the positional advantage that would allow a killing shot. The German pilot made his mistake when he assumed that Webb's defensive flying indicated inferior skill rather than tactical patience. Committing to an aggressive attack run, the German ace exposed his aircraft's vulnerable underbelly for the fraction of a second that Webb needed. The burst was perfect, hitting the enemy fighter's engine and cockpit simultaneously. The aircraft disintegrated in midair, its pilot killed instantly by rounds that had found their mark with lethal precision. Across the battlefield, similar engagements were reaching their conclusions. Foster downed 2 German fighters in quick succession, his gunnery demonstrating the hours of practice that Tuskegee training had required. Other pilots from the 332nd Fighter Group were achieving similar results, their tactical discipline and combat effectiveness overwhelming German pilots who had expected easy victories. The bomber formation reached Berlin and delivered its payload with minimal losses. The return flight encountered reduced enemy resistance as German fighter squadrons, having sustained devastating casualties, declined to press further attacks. The mission was declared a complete success, with bomber losses far below predictions and enemy fighter losses significantly higher than normal. The intelligence reports filed after the mission documented what had occurred with clinical precision. The 332nd Fighter Group had engaged superior numbers of enemy aircraft and achieved a kill ratio that exceeded that of any other American fighter squadron in the European theater. German losses included multiple experienced pilots whose deaths would significantly impact Luftwaffe operational capability. The red-tailed fighters had demonstrated combat effectiveness that contradicted every racist assumption about black aviators' capabilities. The reaction among bomber crews was immediate and unequivocal. Pilots who had questioned whether black escorts could be trusted with their lives became adamant supporters of the Tuskegee Airmen, when delays, with permissaders and aviator ready PNM Sabzabilit. Mission planners began specifically assigning the 332nd Fighter Group to the most dangerous raids, confident that their presence would maximize bomber survival rates. The transformation in attitude was so complete that it seemed to erase the skepticism that had existed just months earlier. Mitchell flew his final combat mission escorted by the red-tailed fighters in late September. The target was another oil facility, heavily defended and considered extremely dangerous. His crew had been nervous during the pre-mission briefing until they learned which fighter group would be providing escort. The announcement that the 332nd would be protecting them had been greeted with visible relief and even enthusiasm. The mission itself had been challenging, with sustained German fighter attacks and heavy anti-aircraft fire over the target. But the red-tailed escorts had performed with the reliable excellence that had become their trademark. Mitchell's bomber had returned to base with battle damage but with all crew members alive. He filed a report specifically praising the escort fighters whose presence had made the difference between survival and becoming another statistic in the casualty reports. By October 1944, the cumulative losses inflicted on the Luftwaffe by the Tuskegee Airmen approached 100 aircraft destroyed. The number was staggering not just for its magnitude but for what it represented. Black pilots whom both American and German leadership had dismissed as incompetent had become one of the most effective fighter units in the European theater. The German pilots who had laughed at the red-tailed fighters now avoided them when possible and engaged them reluctantly when combat was unavoidable. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. African American service members across all branches of the military heard about the Tuskegee Airmen's achievements. The story of black pilots dominating the skies over Europe, destroying German fighters flown by adherents to Nazi racial theories, resonated with profound symbolic significance. Every victory was proof that the racist assumptions underlying segregation were lies. Every successful mission was evidence that ability had nothing to do with skin color. Webb received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony that would have been impossible to imagine when he first applied to aviation training. The citation praised his tactical leadership and combat effectiveness without any qualification or diminishment based on race. The award recognized him simply as an outstanding fighter pilot, which was all he had ever wanted to be. The transformation in how military leadership viewed black aviators was incomplete and would require decades more struggle before full equality was achieved. But the Tuskegee Airmen had shattered assumptions that would have persisted indefinitely without their exceptional performance. The final statistics told a story that no amount of prejudice could obscure. The 332nd Fighter Group flew over 15,000 sorties, destroyed or damaged hundreds of enemy aircraft, and achieved bomber protection rates that exceeded those of any comparable unit. They had proven that courage, skill, and dedication transcended race. They had demonstrated that underestimating people based on their skin color was not just morally wrong but tactically foolish. The German pilots who survived the war would remember the red-tailed fighters with professional respect, stripped of the contempt that had characterized their initial encounters. The bomber crews who returned home alive because of Tuskegee escorts would spend the rest of their lives defending the men who had saved them against anyone who questioned their capabilities. The legacy extended beyond military achievement into the broader civil rights movement that would transform American society in the decades following the war. The laughter that had greeted the arrival of black fighter pilots in the European theater had been replaced by something far more meaningful. Respect earned through excellence that could not be denied. Recognition that ability had nothing to do with race. Understanding that prejudice was not just unjust but dangerous, blinding people to capabilities that could determine the outcome of life and death struggles. The 100 German aircraft destroyed by the Tuskegee Airmen represented more than tactical victories. They were proof that the assumptions underlying segregation were fundamental. While they were evidence that excellence emerged from opportunity and training rather than racial characteristics, they were confirmation that the fight for equality was not just morally necessary but essential for a nation that claimed to value merit and achievement. The men who flew the red-tailed fighters understood that their achievements would outlast their individual lives. They had opened doors that prejudice had kept closed. They had proven capabilities that racism had insisted didn't exist. They had transformed not just military aviation but the broader conversation about race and ability in American society. The German pilots had stopped laughing, the bomber crews had started believing. And the Tuskegee Airmen had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound victories are achieved not through force alone but through excellence that refuses to be denied. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.